So last week we looked at the Exodus, where God takes a group of people, an extended family group, and turns them into his people. And how he delivered them, not just from physical slavery, but he also delivered them from spiritual slavery. And this week I want to look at how God takes his people and forms them, and how that still is something that God is doing in us today. So God creates a people for what end? Well, God tells Abraham something of what's going to happen in the first call that Abraham gets at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12, in which God tells Abraham, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse whoever curses you. And all the people of the earth will be blessed through you." So Israel is meant to be a blessing to the world. That's why God has called them to be his people. But what does that look like? How does Israel bless the world? Well, just following the Exodus, God tells Moses what the plan is. So in Exodus 19, 4-6, we read, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So Israel's calling as God's people is to be holy. Holy means to be set apart, meaning that their life together is to serve some purpose that God has for them. And that their purpose that he has for them is to be priests. Now, priests are mediators between God and people. And so if Israel functions as a kingdom of priests, what that means is that they will show the world what God is like. That through their life together, the world catches a glimpse of this God who is Lord of all. And God gives them this task by keeping the law. So they're supposed to show the world what God is like by keeping the law. Which begs the question, however simple it might seem, what does it mean to keep the law? Now, at first glance, this seems like a rather simple thing to ask. How do I keep the law? Well, I just do what it tells me to do, or don't do what it tells me not to do. But throughout all of history, and especially at the time of Jesus, we see that this approach to keeping the law can lead us to unintended consequences. So let's call this the Bible as rule book way of reading the law. What happens when we try to obey the Bible as if it is some sort of a rule book that simply governs our interactions the way that, say, the Criminal Code of Canada or some other legal document functions? Well, first, the law becomes an obligation. The law becomes a set of rules imposed by God on his people that where God punishes the smallest infraction. Now, as fallen human beings, we have a tendency to, come up with rules about which ones are the best or which ones are the most serious laws to break based on what's easy for us. And so we often find ourselves saying that the sins that we don't struggle with are the bad sins, and the sins that we struggle with are the not so bad sins. We end up penalizing certain types of actions, smoking, drinking, swearing, while at the same time giving people a pass for things that are maybe a little bit more difficult to nail down, like greed or pride. And so the law is an obligation. Obeying the law is about earning God's favor, if this is how we interpret what being faithful to the law is meant to be. So we keep the laws. In exchange, God gives us blessing. But the relationship between people who are simply keeping the law and expecting a blessing from God is a transactional one. I give, God gives back. There's no love in that relationship. There's simply, it's like a commercial relationship. And so our approach robs God's deliverance of his people of any sort of grace, and it simply becomes merit. I do good, and so God saves me. If I do bad, God doesn't save me. Another function of obeying the law as a rule book is that it changes my status relative to other people. If I'm the kind of person who can heroically keep all of the rules, then I have high status in the religious community. And if you are the kind of person who struggles to keep those rules, then you have lower status in the community. And what ends up happening then is the people at the top end of that tier can look down their noses at the people at the bottom. There's a prayer that Jesus recounts in his ministry in which a Pharisee thanks God that he's so good. God, I'm so thankful that I pray 3 times a day and I fast twice a week, and that I'm not a disgusting sinner like this tax collector over here. And the tax collector says, have mercy on me, God, I'm a sinner. And Jesus says it's the tax collector, not the Pharisee, who's right with God at that moment. And so when we keep the law as simply a rule book, the result is pride or shame. Pride if we feel like we're doing well, shame if we feel like we're not, or maybe a mix of the two. If we feel that we don't do as well as some people, we feel shame about that, but then we pump ourselves up by looking down on the people we feel like do worse than we do. And so this attempt at obeying the law by simply keeping its letter turns salvation into an act of merit rather than grace, and it misses the point. The law is about creating a society that demonstrates God's shalom. Now, shalom is a word in Hebrew that we often translate as peace, but it actually means a lot more than that. Shalom is completeness and wholeness. Shalom is what happens when people live in community that is life-giving and mutual, where there's collaboration and cooperation and where everyone flourishes. In a sense, it's a picture of what heaven would be like. That's what God wants for his people. And so God wants his people to demonstrate that, but when we demonstrate a self-righteous attitude, we distort the picture that people see of God. So being faithful to the law can't simply be a matter of trying to do all the different things that it says. So how ought we to approach it? Well, some people say then we should just throw out the law. After all, this is the New Testament. We're under grace, not under the law. But this very easily becomes, I can do whatever I want because God is going to forgive me. And heck, the more bad stuff that I do, the more God gets to forgive me. And he delights to forgive me and show off his grace. And so, hey, Paul says, shall we sin that grace may increase? No way. Jesus tells us that the law has not stopped to function. The law is not invalid or abolished by the New Testament. Instead, we have to reimagine it. So Jesus says, do you think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets? I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commandments and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, there are some people I've heard that say, well, what Jesus is saying here is that he fulfills the law, meaning he perfectly obeys the law, and therefore we don't have to. That Jesus did it for us. And that Jesus is basically saying that the law won't vanish until everything is accomplished, and everything accomplished is his death and resurrection. But that doesn't make any sense, because these texts are written down decades after Jesus' death and resurrection. And so if Jesus is trying to say, well, the law still is valid for months to come, but after his death and resurrection, the law was going to cease to function, then why would they bother including this in the Gospels? After all, John says that there's more stuff to write down in the book that Jesus did than books could contain, so why would you write a story about how the law was still valid at that very moment, but no longer is. Rather, the thing isn't that we have thrown out the law, but rather that Jesus shows us a better way of what the law, of how the law is done. When Jesus is fulfilling the law, what it means is he's keeping the law the way that the law was intended to be kept. Not in slavish obedience to particular rules, but rather internalizing the values that it is trying to put forward and living those out in his own time and place. He's calling his followers not to abandon law, but to keep the law through cross-shaped love. Not as a way of earning God's approval, but as a way of fulfilling our calling to be a priestly community. You see, the law as rules was never the point. It was meant to point towards God's character, but that character has been fully revealed in Jesus. Now, if you've ever been a parent or you've been around small children, you know that you have to start parenting with very black and white concrete rules. Don't hit your sister. Eat your vegetables. Don't put your vegetables up your nose. And so, the idea is not to continue to keep saying those sorts of rules. The idea instead is to move away from rules and towards values. If I tell my 4-year-old twins that they should be conscientious and considerate, they don't have a clue what that means. And so I try to encapsulate that in rules that I give them that point in that direction. And so the law functions much the same way. Well, God is taking this group of slaves and helping them understand what reality is. He can't just tell them to be loving because they have no idea what loving looks like. And so he gives them a set of concrete rules. But those concrete rules are trying to help them become more loving from the place where they are. And that's why the law can seem rather strange in some of the individual rules. You see, some of the rules just seem weird. Why do I have to wear tassels on all of my garments? Some of the rules seem downright scary. I'm supposed to cut off what? And some of the rules seem morally disturbing. Oh, it's okay for me to own a slave? But this set of rules is trying to help Israel better embody God's shalom compared to the nations that surround them and compared to the life that they have had. God is going to continue to take them closer and closer to his intention until he is fully revealed in Jesus. So, we don't keep the law by doing exactly what it says down to the letter. And we don't keep the law, or we don't throw the law out, but rather we keep the law by loving. And so this forces us to reimagine what the law is. The law is not an obligation, but rather the law is a reimagining of what the world could be. Taken together, these laws point towards a society where there is greater shalom, peace, completeness, and flourishing. The law is not about earning God's favor. It's about remaking the world in participation with God. So our world is corrupted. We can all see this. We know that in our own lives we struggle with sin and selfishness. We look out there and we see disease, and we see exploitation, and we see dehumanization, and we see all sorts of things that cause us fear and sorrow. And God is at work in this world undoing all of that. But how does he undo it? He undoes it when individual people change their heart from being one that pursues themselves to being one that pursues the common good, that pursues others in love. And so, as people who live natural lives, our actions are a net negative. We contribute to the way that this world is broken. But if we submit to God and allow his Spirit to come and work in our hearts become less a part of the problem and more a part of the solution. And so God is using that to remake the world by creating a community of people whose lives are oriented towards God and towards each other instead of oriented towards themselves. And as they do this, their life together demonstrates that God is in the business of saving people and of transforming lives. And so it's not about us earning God's favor. It's about us participating with God as he's remaking this world. The law doesn't change my status relative to others, sorting us out into a community of saints and sinners. Rather, the law is meant to help us belong. Imagine a community where everybody cared for the needs of others. Imagine a community where everyone shared freely what they had with others who had less than them. This isn't a community where we stack people in order from holy to not holy. This is a community where everyone feels like they belong. God is trying to create his people to be a community where everyone belongs, where everyone can flourish. And the result of keeping the law this way is not pride or shame, but of more love. We will learn to love one another if we follow. If we love, we will learn to love more. I guess that's one way of saying it. So, nobody can see God. The world sees God through his people. We act as a window that helps the world to see what God is like. If he is the force that animates our lives, then they start to get a glimpse of who this God is. Now, the Pharisees and modern legalists who insist that we're just supposed to obey a set of rules, they distort a picture of God that the world has. And the world thinks that God is self-righteous and judgmental. But what happens if a community that loves God and loves each other is what people see when they look at God? Then they understand that God is a God of radical forgiveness, a God of inclusion, a God who can be approached by anybody, not just the most pious among us. And so, basically, our lives become an invitation for God, or for people to come to God and find his salvation. So just like our lives and Israel's lives sort of parallel each other, last week we looked at how God set Israel free from slavery and how he is still at work setting his people, the church, free. So we can see that God creates his people, Israel, to be a holy priesthood for him, and that God creates his people, the church, to be a holy priesthood for him. That we can demonstrate his power to set us free, not free to do as we wish, but free to live apart from the power of sin that works to destroy our lives. God's law is not about an emotional need to dominate us or to control us. Instead, God is helping us to participate with him in his reconciliation of all things to himself. You ever seen a little boy help his dad change the oil in his car? Maybe a 5-year-old boy. Hey, Daddy, can I help you? Yeah, sure. Hold the oil pan over here. Dad doesn't need the help of the little boy, does he? Sometimes, when my kids ask to help me in the kitchen, they actually get in the way. But at the same time, I invite them into the process because then they have a sense of accomplishment, that I've included them in something important. And I think God is doing something similar to us. God says, I'm at work destroying the work of evil in this world, restoring this world, and I want you to be a part of that because this is the most meaningful thing that we can do. And I want you to have that sense of accomplishment. I want to spend time with you. And so, God invites us to be participants with him in his salvation of the world. So our calling is to be a people of love whose life together shows the world the beauty of God. That's why when Peter is describing the church, he doesn't have to invent new language. He doesn't have to say, well, Israel did this and you do that. Instead, he can use the exact same language that God tells Moses about what the church is supposed to be. And he can apply that same language to the church. And so I leave you this morning with a quote from Peter where he tells us what we are supposed to be. He says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light.